We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump faced off in a debate on Tuesday for the first and probably the last time. If this was a demonstration of American democracy, a greater part of the world must be scratching its head. Welcome to the Socialist program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking with Claudia De La Cruz. She is a presidential candidate for the Party for Socialism and Liberation. She is a lifelong community organizer, popular educator, and theologian. Claudia, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I have to say, I was looking for you in the debate, Claudia, and you and the other progressive candidates, you weren't there. You've been excluded from the debates. The Democrats and the Republicans have excluded your voice. I have to say, having listened to you many, many times, that if either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, or before Kamala Harris, Joe Biden had debated you, people all around the country and all around the world would have thought, yeah, I agree with what she's saying. But it's precisely for that reason that socialist candidates are actually excluded, historically excluded. And it's not just socialists. Any progressive candidate, even when Ralph Nader was running for the Green Party and filling Madison Square Garden in a couple days' notice in 2000, the Democrats and the Republicans made sure to exclude him, even though he was drawing huge crowds. And in fact, they threatened to arrest him when he came to the debate. At the same time, the Democratic Party has been moving to cancel you and the Party for Socialism and Liberation. You're being challenged in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, in Ohio. These are mainly well-funded efforts by the Democratic Party. Here, this is American democracy, except it's like, as Lenin described, it's a democracy for a particular class. I want to talk about that today. Who is this democracy actually for? But also, having watched the debate, I know you were outside protesting. I hope you had a chance to watch it afterwards. This was so superficial. This was like a wrestling match. And people are asking, who won the debate? And I would say, well, Wall Street won the debate. The military-industrial complex won the debate. The Israeli government certainly won the debate. But anyway, the superficiality of it doesn't match the crying, dire needs for tens of millions of working-class people in the United States and for millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world who want the U.S. war drive to end. Anyway, let's get started.
I mean, you're totally right. It was a fixed fight. That's what it was. It was a fixed fight. And I think it's important to mention that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party fear opposition. They have way more in common with each other than they have with the majority of people in this country. And what we saw last night was two candidates of the ruling class who respond to the Wall Street bankers, to the corporations, to the Pentagon, pointing fingers at each other for everything that both parties have failed to do for working class people during their time in the White House, while guaranteeing their donors and the factions of their political class that they will continue to preserve the capitalist system and U.S. imperialism at the expense of the people. That is what we saw. It was theater, and it was ridiculous, and it was also very disrespectful to working class people because neither candidates were able to propose any solutions to the problems people are facing. I mean, it is crazy that they're not talking about the state of emergency that working class people are experiencing in this country, where you have more than half of the population in this country that could barely make ends meet. And the prices on essential goods continue to increase. We're talking about a minimum wage that has not been raised since 2009, while all these prices are incrementing, are going crazy in terms of what people can and cannot afford. And so to see those two, who are not very much different from each other, fighting over who loves Israel most and who will attack immigrants most, it's really ridiculous. It's a
No,
circus.
I hear you on that. And I think, again, I really think it says so much about, quote, American democracy that you, Jill Stein, Cornel West, candidates who obviously their message is resonating with tens of millions of people are excluded from the debates. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure that you were here as the socialist program. Yours is the only explicitly socialist campaign, and we are the socialist program. So naturally, we have an affinity with your message. But it is a tortured form of democracy when it's only these two ruling class parties get to actually debate. And, you know, everybody, well, not everybody, around the world, people are told by U.S. government representatives, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, follow America, follow America's lead. Now, democracy, you have to ask, Claudia, and I'll say to you as a socialist, you have to put it into class terms. Like, democracy for whom? When we think about Athenian democracy, we all learned as kids that American democracy is premised originally on the Athens of antiquity. Well, 50% of the people in Athens were slaves. So the democracy existed for the non-slave population, but the people who did all the work were the slaves. So there was no democracy for the slaves, and there's no democracy for enslaved people in the United States, you know, which only formally ended in 1865. But it's such a tortured form of democracy for working class people and for working class parties that when you call it democracy, there has to be a great big asterisk attached to it.
As Malcolm X said, I think it's important to remember, he said that American democracy is hypocrisy. And I would say that American bourgeois democracy is not democracy. It's definitely hypocrisy. And it doesn't put people's interests or struggles at the forefront. It never has and it never will. So when you see the blocking of third party candidates from the ballot, paying millions of dollars to get third party candidates off ballots all across this country, putting efforts into not having us access mainstream media so that we don't have access to the debate stage. None of that is a coincidence. All of that is pretty much inherent to the bourgeois democracy that protects capitalism. And we need to be really clear about that. When you have a debate with someone like Trump and someone like Harris, there's no real opposition. In fact, I would say that both parties are very much afraid of opposition. They are very much afraid of standing toe to toe against working class people, because working class people will raise working class issues that they have no solutions to.
Yeah, it's amazing what you're saying. The Democrats have created, I think it's $100 million fund to make sure that you and other progressive candidates are evicted from the ballot. And I'm talking about all the swing states and beyond the swing states. They're heavily invested. They have deep pockets to fund lawyers who are coming up with these great spurious challenges trying to evict you from the ballot. That's going on in many, many states. And it's actually, again, another example of this kind of tortured form of democracy that you're talking about. I want to talk about some of the things that actually were said in the debate, and I want to get your response. Again, you're excluded, so I want to play some of these clips and get you to respond as if you were finally in the debate. Some of them are amazing. Donald Trump, it was like a one-note choir almost. Well, he had two notes. Kamala Harris is a communist. Obviously, the Democratic Party is a communist party, but mainly against immigrants. And some of the stuff was so ludicrous, so crazy. And then, of course, on the issue of abortion, Trump sounded like a complete maniac. So in that sense, Kamala Harris could sound reasonably reasonable. I mean, because she didn't sound like Donald Trump. But then I want to play some of the stuff that Kamala Harris was saying which basically telegraphs the people of this country that if she is elected, we're going to have endless war. Anyway, let's start with Trump. It's a clip. He's talking about how immigrants are eating pets.
What they have done to our country by allowing these millions and millions of people to come into our country, and look at what's happening to the towns all over the United States. And a lot of towns don't want to talk. It's not going to be Aurora or Springfield. A lot of towns don't want to talk about it because they're so embarrassed by it. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country, and it's a shame.
I mean, the demonization of immigrants, Claudia, has reached new proportions.
Demonization, criminalization, and all sorts of ludicrous accounts by Trump. The worst person to put anything up like that. I think it's important to mention that the so-called migrant crises that both parties have been talking about has been caused precisely because there's U.S. imperialism that is stomping on the necks of countries like Venezuela with the sanctions, with Cuba, with an over 60-year-old blockade that steals $15 million a day from the Cuban economy. It has to do with the constant intervention in countries like Haiti, the wars that have been launched against people in the Middle East and Africa. I mean, it is U.S. empire that has caused the climate catastrophe that we are experiencing. And so the millions and millions of people that are forced to move across borders wouldn't have to do that if they would be allowed to create nation states that provide for them. And the United States has been has been destroying that possibility for decades. And so we need to be really clear on what is the responsibility of US capitalists and US imperialists in people's need to migrate, because no one actually just wakes up one day and says, I want to be caught in the border of the US and Mexico, or the border of US and Canada, and be tortured and be, taken away from my family. No one makes that decision. It is a decision that is imposed on people who don't have access, and that access has been stolen from them. So they come to this country following the traces of the things that have been stolen from them. And we need to be clear, and none of these two candidates are serious enough to assume the responsibility and say that what we need to do is understand foreign policy in relationship to migration and create a foreign policy that is not based on extraction and is not based on taking over the world at the expense of working people everywhere.
Yeah, Vijay Prashad, who's been on this show and who's an amazing writer and researcher, just put out a piece for Tricontinental Research about migration. And the numbers that we were using here at the Socialist program, which were about 60 million people in general, are on the move. They're moving somewhere because they're escaping war, they're escaping poverty, they're escaping violence, they're escaping climate catastrophe. According to his most recent dossier, and it's an excellent piece, people can check it out for themselves, he puts the number at more like 200 million people. This would be more people on the move globally than at any time since World War II, and maybe even during World War II. And World War II, of course, is the violence of World War II was of such a magnitude that 80 million people were killed in 5 years, and societies were dislocated. But when you put together neoliberal capitalism, economic sanctions, U.S. military invasions and wars, climate catastrophe, meaning the rising sea levels in particular for people living in coastal areas, you can see that this is not an ephemeral problem. This is not about to go away. This is an enduring structural problem of late-stage capitalism. And again, all these two candidates can do is try to beat each other up without actually addressing the issue. Because if they address the issue, Claudia, they'd have to say, as we say on this show, that the current system isn't working, that you would actually need a new system, which doesn't mean we can't have a new system. It's not like something that can't be achieved. Go ahead.
Mhm. No, I mean it's totally achievable. It's necessary and it's achievable, but it goes against their donors. It goes against Wall Street. It goes against the Pentagon. It goes against the corporations that are making literally a killing from stealing lands of people all across this globe. And so I think if they were to take responsibility, that would necessitate actions to be able to correct the course. And that is something that they're unwilling to do because they are there to protect and preserve US imperialism. And so when we see debates like these, they will not point to the root of the problem and they will not give us the actual solutions. What they will do is play football with our issues and point fingers at each other and assure these corporations, these Wall Street bankers, and the Pentagon that they will continue to stay in line and protect their interests, not our interests. And I really wish that people across this country who are not immigrants could also take to heart that it is against them as well that this attack is happening because we are part of a huge working class family all across the globe. And we have a responsibility as American citizens to call into account these politicians that never do anything to advance our concerns, to advance our quality of life, and yet say that they're doing all of what they're doing in our name and to protect us. But they're really doing it to protect the interests of capitalism.
And speaking of that, capitalism needs the labor of immigrant workers. I mean, there are 15 million, maybe 20 million undocumented folks in the United States. Without them, big parts of the economy just don't work. I mean, this is not like sort of a marginal part of the working class. It's a very significant, I would say, central anchoring part of the proletariat, the working class in the United States. And yet, at the same time, as American capital becomes a magnet drawing labor towards the United States because it needs labor, it needs this labor, it can then turn around and demonize the undocumented and say to the native-born American worker, hey, you're suffering, you can't pay your doctor's bills, you can't afford childcare, you can't pay gas. The cost of eggs has gone up 56% since a dozen eggs since 2020. It's not capitalism isn't the problem. It's not the billionaires that are the problem. It's these immigrants, these poor sections of the working class. So the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, the capitalists, they play it both ways. They attract labor. They bring labor to the United States because they need it, not for some altruistic reason, but then they can turn around and scapegoat those same workers. So the only answer from a socialist point of view is to build socialist solidarity. In other words, to say the workers of the world actually have more in common with each other regardless of ethnicity or nationality, and certainly legal documents given the precarious character of this big part of the U.S. working class. American unions need to reach out to these workers. They need to be unionized.
Right.
They need to be organized. Go ahead.
No, I completely agree. I think that there's a need to organize migrant workers. I believe very, very strongly that these communities are contributing to the economy of this country and not reaping the benefits. These are folks that are living in the shadow because there's fear. And there's fear because there's xenophobia and there are attacks. And obviously, if the leaders, the top leaders of this country are the ones that are saying that they should be persecuted, that they should be jailed, that they should be deported, then people will follow suit and people will commit hate crimes against our migrant brothers and sisters. And I think it's important for us to understand that this is a community of workers that is contributing to the economy, that is forced to live in many ways in the shadows, that are not the ones that are there asking for support from the government because they have maybe no way of doing it and they're fearful of that. Um, and in so many ways, one of our values should be that of solidarity and should be that of supporting those that are made vulnerable by the system. And migrants are made vulnerable by the system. So, organizing and educating communities in the United States about how necessary it is for us to build that level of revolutionary solidarity and socialist solidarity that you were talking about is so important, and how our issues are connected, because the ways that these communities are being displaced all across the globe, again, by the climate catastrophe, by sanctions, by war, things that are coming and are being created from the White House, from the Pentagon, and being exported to the world. There is a responsibility that we have to be able to, in so many ways, restore the order of things. And we start by organizing, and we start by building that solidarity that is so necessary.
One of the things that I think is an obvious phenomena that's going on is that when progressive people hear Donald Trump talking like this about immigrants or about Muslims or about abortion or about trans people, whatever the targeted community is, when progressive people hear Trump talk, he's so loathsome, he's so disgusting that they think, well, Kamala Harris is at least a better alternative than Donald Trump. And, you know, on the question of abortion, certainly Kamala Harris's position is different than Donald Trump. But while she champions abortion rights, it was during the Biden administration that Roe v. Wade went away. It was during the last 4 years when the Democrats had the control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. The first 2 years of the Biden-Harris administration, they could have made abortion rights the law of the land, not contingent on a Supreme Court decision. They could have passed legislation in the House, companion legislation in the Senate, and then President Biden could have signed it. And they did not do that. So for people who say, look, Trump is so bad we must support the Democrats, look at the record. Look at the last 4 years. The Democrats could have done whatever they wanted to do because they had that capacity when they controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House. And they did do whatever they wanted to do, and it didn't include abortion rights.
I would go even further back in history. We need to think about the Obama administration. Obama was in power for 8 years, and he could have also codified abortion rights for women and chose not to do that. What he chose to do was to bail out the banks at the expense of the people, and obviously not give anything of what he promised to working class people here, but go across and bomb countries. I think it was 8 countries that he led bombings on. So I think we need to remember that Democrats have actually been in control of our country for 12 years in the last 16 years. And they have not given us what they have promised. What they do, and they do very well, is utilize our issues as things that they dangle in front of us and tell us, if you vote for me, we'll give you this. If you vote for me, we'll give you that. And people go on and vote for them, and continuously they are betrayed by people who have no real interest in solving our issues. Abortion rights, as you mentioned, could have been codified in the first 2 years of the Biden-Harris administration, and they didn't do it. And they didn't do it because, again, they will continue to use that as bribe. Everything and anything that is things that are of concern to us, concerned to the average American, will be a bribe to lead us, to funnel us into continuously consenting to our exploitation every 4 years. I feel it's important to raise that they will say when we reach gridlock, everything is a gridlock. What they never find gridlock for is war. That they agree from both sides of the aisle. That's something that they're both in agreement. And I believe also that they are very much in agreement in waging war against the working class people here. If they were to provide that concession to women across this country, they're also in so many ways detaching themselves from the conservative parts of the Republicans and the Democrats, because they are conservative Democrats as well. I mean, Biden wouldn't say the word abortion. He always talked about reproductive rights, but he never uttered the word abortion. And so we need to be really clear. Harris is obviously a woman of color that could, in the ideal world, have some sort of sympathy with working class women, which ultimately are the ones that are demanding abortion rights, because all other women could travel. They could travel across state lines and they could travel across the globe to get an abortion. Working class women cannot afford that. And so we need to be really clear on who our enemies are. And Kamala Harris, the Biden administration, the Obama administration, were never friends of the people.
Yeah, I remember the Dreamers, who were young people fighting for immigrant rights and for their own legal status, labeled Obama deporter in chief, because up until that point, the Democrats under President Obama, who was not George W. Bush, he was not a conservative Republican, were deporting more people than any other previous president. It's ironic that Trump and the Republicans are now, excuse me, are now lambasting the Democrats as being like for open borders or something like that, when in fact the Democrats have had this very, very tough position against immigrant workers. This has been going on and on. The one thing you mentioned that I want to sort of turn to or pivot towards, Claudia, is that both parties are 100% behind the endless wars of U.S. imperialism, the military budget that makes those wars possible. And that military budget, which is more than $1 trillion a year when you really look at all the different elements of the federal budget where so-called defense spending is located, it's more than $1 trillion every year, way more than any other country in the world, more than the next 10 countries in the world combined. We had Trump last night saying, Biden and Harris made the U.S. military weaker. They don't respect us anymore. The foreign leaders used to fear me and respect me, and they wouldn't start wars because our American military was so great and so dynamic and so powerful. They weakened the military. And then I want to play a clip from Kamala Harris, and this is her response. This is her response to the allegation that they are, quote, weakening the U.S. military. If anything, it sounds more warlike than Donald Trump, which says so much about the two parties. And again, for people who think, well, Kamala Harris is better on abortion or better on this or that, I mean, we're talking about endless war and the diversion of huge parts, the lion's share of the discretionary part of the federal budget, for the purpose of death and destruction rather than meeting human needs, when half the country, as you put it, is either in poverty or close to poverty. Anyway, let's listen to Kamala Harris talk about that last night. Let's listen to Kamala Harris talk about that Tuesday night in the debate.
If Donald Trump were president, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv right now. And understand what that would mean, because Putin's agenda is not just about Ukraine. Understand why the European allies and our NATO allies are so thankful that you are no longer president, and that we understand the importance of the greatest military alliance the world has ever known, which is NATO.
The greatest military alliance ever known. Well, NATO was created in 1949. Now, the destruction of Libya in 2011, the destruction of Yugoslavia in 1999, the NATO's war in Afghanistan that resulted in the Taliban victory, but 250,000 Afghans, most of whom had never heard of the World Trade Center, died. The greatest military alliance in the world. Anyway, Claudia, this is not an alternative to the Republicans.
No, I mean, in fact, Democrats are warmongers, and we should know that. We should be really clear that Democrats historically have warmongered. These folks have been driving the U.S. war machine. And when she is so and when she is so proudly speaking about NATO, which is an instrument of destruction, it is the equivalent of AFRICOM in Africa, is the equivalent of the Southern Command in this continent, and it's the equivalent of Israel in the Middle East. She's talking about genocidal instruments in such a proud way. She has such a huge alliance to these instruments and such a commitment to the military industrial complex that we cannot be fooled. She is definitely, definitely not in opposition to Trump, not any better. This war in Ukraine is a proxy war of US imperialism. It is not a fight of Ukrainians, it is a fight of the US while Ukrainians are dying. Not Trump or Kamala care about the lives of Ukrainians, care about the lives of Russians, care about the lives of Americans.
Yeah. I want to play a couple of clips that it's Kamala Harris during her acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention last month. And again, it goes to the same issue. And the reason I want to play it is I want to make the point for our audience that what she said in the debate, in the back and forth in the debate, it wasn't accidental. It wasn't incidental. It's actually a central part of her program. This is from the DNC. It's her talking again about Ukraine war and NATO. This was a month ago, not last night in the debate, not under the duress of a back and forth that happens during debates. Let's listen.
Trump, on the other hand, threatened to abandon NATO. He encouraged Putin to invade our allies, said Russia could, quote, do whatever the hell they want. 5 days before Russia attacked Ukraine, I met with President Zelensky to warn him about Russia's plan to invade. I helped mobilize a global response, over 50 countries, to defend against Putin's aggression. And as president, I will stand strong with Ukraine and our NATO allies.
Well, Claudia, I mean, this deserves a little bit more exploration because Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. The month or two before that, the Russians amassed large numbers of troops in Belarus and also in the eastern part of Ukraine, inside of Russia. And Putin said, we have red lines, and the U.S. cannot cross them. The red lines are NATO cannot expand into Ukraine, meaning you cannot bring U.S. missiles, including nuclear missiles and conventional missiles, to our border in Ukraine. We're not going to let you do that. And if you do that, and if you agree with us that Ukraine will be a neutral country, we can come to an agreement. And Biden and Harris, that administration, said no to the Russians. They said those demands, those red lines are non-starters. And so 3 months later, Russia invades. Now, since that time, according to the Pentagon statistics, as many as 500,000 people in Ukraine and Russia are either dead or badly wounded. Now, this war was completely avoidable. Kamala Harris shares responsibility with Biden for torpedoing the negotiations that would have made the war avoidable. And then she turns around and says, we have to defend the Ukrainian people. Well, I'm sorry, but if you're a working class family in Ukraine and you've just lost your son or your daughter or your husband or wife or your grandchildren, it doesn't feel like the U.S., the Biden administration and Harris are, quote, saving Ukrainians. This was an avoidable war. And that's a truth that neither side really explains. In a way, Trump sort of hints at it, but he doesn't come out and say it because he's going to pursue the same policy if he does become president once again.
I mean, all wars, right, are avoidable. I think if you're able to respect the sovereignty of nations, there's always space for discussion. There's always space for debate. But in the same ways that I mentioned earlier, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party fear opposition. They fear opposition worldwide. They fear the possibility of anything or anyone or any country that could potentially develop itself without the boot of US empire on their necks. They need to be within the hegemony, within the dominance of the United States. And Russia was unwilling to do that. It set its red line very clearly. But the NATO project for the United States, the NATO instrument, is what matters. Ukrainians are collateral damage, which is a word that they like to use very much. They're collateral damage. They're utilized for the purpose of advancing NATO, and whatever happens to Ukrainians is not something that the Democrats or the Republicans will ever assume responsibility for, because they never do. And so I agree in terms of this war being an avoidable thing. And I'd like to say that most wars, most imperialist wars could be avoided if the United States government, if the government administrations from the US would take another approach to building relationship across the globe rather than imposing war on other countries.
Well, I want to play another clip from Kamala Harris at the debate. This is where she's taunting Trump and sort of accusing him of being like Kim Jong-un, who's the head of state of North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. She made the same speech basically at the DNC a month ago. I want to play it because, again, when we're talking about wars that could be avoided, obviously the Ukraine war could have been avoided. The U.S. wanted the war, otherwise they would have come to the negotiating table. But there's another war, the war in Korea, that began June 25th, 1950. You know, that's now almost 75 years ago. It will be 75 years next year. And there's no peace treaty ending the war. And U.S. troops still occupy South Korea. And of course, Trump made an initiative, or really responded to the initiative of the North Korean government for the possibility of a peace treaty. And he went and met with Kim Jong-un twice, once in Singapore and once in Hanoi in 2018, 2019. And it looked like the war in Korea might come to an end, that there might be the possibility of a new relationship between North Korea and the U.S., normalized relations. The U.S. government basically was against Trump on that, and the Democrats were hollering about it as if it was a great crime for the Korean War to ever come to an end. Anyway, here's Kamala Harris going back to the same theme, and I think it's so important because if there's any sort of flashpoint in world politics besides Ukraine, it's the Korean Peninsula. Anyway, let's listen.
Donald Trump is weak and wrong on national security and foreign policy. It is well known that he admires dictators, wants to be a dictator on day one, according to himself. It is well known that he said of Putin that he can do whatever the hell he wants and go into Ukraine. It is well known that he said when Russia went into Ukraine, it was brilliant. It is well known he exchanged love letters with Kim Jong-un.
They weren't love letters, Claudia. They were, love letters are one thing. I think we all know what love letters are. These were not love letters. But it's this kind of baiting of Trump for daring to engage in negotiations with Kim Jong-un to possibly end the Korean War.
You know, what's funny? That the Democratic Party that talks so much about defending democracy are the ones that are actually baiting him on that, on the possibility of actually ending a war. That is ludicrous, as crazy, as ridiculous. And it's ultimately so important to uplift this. They talk so much about national security. They talk so much about securing borders. They talk so much about, protection of the American people. But most people are really not here to applaud or to uplift or to defend the US going to war. They're here to demand access to food, access to housing, access to healthcare, access to education. And so it's always triggering to me in so many ways to hear these people talk about national security without securing the livelihood of American people. They have no right to police the world. In fact, I believe that all and any relationship coming from the United States with other nation states should be one of collaboration, should be one of solidarity, should be one of conversations. Who died and made the US the police force of the world, where they have to go in and be the negotiators for peace, when the United States government historically has been on the opposite side of peace and justice? And so I find it ridiculous that she would even bait or talk about how he's writing love letters. I mean, we know what love letters are. And obviously, those were not love letters, but peace treaties are necessary. Seeing people eye to eye is necessary. And God knows I am not in favor of Trump. I know that he is the epitome of the worst that capitalism can produce, but her baiting him on that is totally ludicrous and just ridiculous.
Well, going back to this whole baiting and superficiality, both of them were competing with each other to see who loved Israel more. Some of it is crazy. I'm going to play a real quick clip. This is where Trump actually calls Kamala Harris a communist. But then I want to go after that, Claudia, to the love fest for Netanyahu. Anyway, let's start with Kamala Harris is a communist, according to Donald Trump.
She's a Marxist. Everybody knows she's a Marxist. Her father's a Marxist professor in economics, and he taught her well.
All right. I just had to play that because poor Lenin, poor Marx. Kamala Harris is a communist. Anyway, let's go on. These are these clips. Did you want to jump in? Go ahead.
I think it's funny that he's using her dad against her when her dad obviously detached himself from Kamala way back. And that has nothing to do with nothing, but I think it's hilarious that he would utilize her dad as a Marxist economist against her, because she is completely far removed from anything that has to do with Marxism. So
yeah, well, let's just remind the audience here that when Kamala got out of law school, her first job was as a prosecutor. Now, when most people go to law school, unless they're going to become just the next set of rich lawyers, if you have an idealistic bone in your body, you come out of law school and you say, how can I become a public defender? Or how can I represent poor people who are, the deck is stacked against them in the so-called criminal justice system? But when you come out of law school and your first job is as a prosecutor, that means that you're joining with the police. And of course, Kamala in that 2020 debate said she's the top cop in California because she went from being prosecutor to attorney general. So it's only in Donald Trump's mind, in the mind of the right wing, that Kamala Harris is a, quote, communist. But again, this is the demonization, the anti-communist crusade. I want to play these clips where both of them are competing with each other to show who loves Netanyahu and Israel more. Let's start with these two clips.
She hates Israel. She wouldn't even meet with Netanyahu when he went to Congress to make a very important speech. She refused to be there because she was at a sorority party of hers. She wanted to go to the sorority party. She hates Israel. If she's president, I believe that Israel will not exist within 2 years from now. And I've been pretty good at predictions, and I hope I'm wrong about that one. She hates Israel. At the same time, in her own way, she hates the Arab population because the whole place is going to get blown up. Arabs, Jewish people, Israel will be gone. It would have never happened.
All right. Well, anyway, I think there's a second clip where Kamala Harris comes in and says, that's crazy. I love Israel. We don't have to play it. Take my word for it, everybody. Kamala Harris is. Anyway, if Claudia, in addition to everything else, if politicians in other countries in the world talked like this, if this was the level of discourse, you would think, okay, this country is just a laughingstock. But America, the biggest, most powerful, richest, most militarily capable country in the world, has politicians of this caliber who talk like this.
Completely politically incompetent, immature, and unserious. That's what they are. I mean, think about it. We're talking about over $300 billion in the last 76 years have been gifted to the apartheid state of Israel to promote an extermination campaign against human beings, against Palestinians, to displace them, to kill them, to exterminate them. I mean, over $300 billion coming from US taxpayers that cannot afford and haven't been able to afford housing, healthcare, education. That is what's happening. And that is, they decide to engage in a battle on who loves Israel most and who tends to Netanyahu the most. It's ridiculous and it's immoral in so many ways. There was no real conversation about what plans are there to place an embargo on weapons, to call, which the United States government can do and could have done 11 months ago, to tell Netanyahu that they would not support their genocidal drive. None of them are going to say that. I mean, they're both financed by AIPAC, which that's another thing. The United States always talk about foreign intervention in politics. Well, there is no best example about foreign intervention in politics than the colonial state of Israel and AIPAC in politics. And so it is just crazy to me that these are not parts of the conversations that the top leaders of this country and the two people that are running to be in the highest office would even put in the table. They are there to say that they love the colonial state of Israel. And then she wraps that language around, I believe in the self-determination and the dignity of Palestinians, which is co-opting language from movement without no real base. Because if she believed in the self-determination and the right of Palestinians to live with a dignity, she would be part of stopping this. And there is no such thing as Kamala working tirelessly, as AOC said in the DNC, to get a ceasefire negotiation. They haven't been working tirelessly for that. In fact, their only negotiation, the only ceasefire agreement that would actually back up is one that supports and it's at the advantage of the colonial state of Israel, which is not good for the Palestinian people. And so it is, again, it's just immoral and disrespectful to humanity to be able to have these two, again, try to engage in a race on who loves Israel, which is a genocidal state at this point. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about that point, Claudia. And I think that there's a reason that such a big part of the Democratic Party base, not just Arab American voters and not just Palestinian voters, but young people especially, who have been in the streets, and you've been in the streets in the last year protesting against this genocide. There's a reason people who are protesting genocide won't support Kamala Harris. They might support the Democrats generally because they're not Donald Trump. They might say, yes, we must have abortion rights. Yes, we have to reject the extreme racism of Trump against immigrants. Yes, we want to do those things, but we can't bring ourselves under the circumstances of a genocide to say that's good enough for us to be able to say yes to a Biden or a Biden-Harris administration or a coming Harris administration. Harris says, as you pointed out, that she talks kind of in an eloquent way about dignity and freedom and self-determination for the Palestinian people. That's in one breath, but right before that, she talks about we must defend Israel, we must stand with Israel, I'm the best friend of Israel, I've always been a friend of Israel. And neither Trump or Harris will say the one thing that could be said, as you pointed out, that would actually stop the genocide, which is if somebody called Netanyahu and said, we will not send one more penny from the United States to support the Israeli regime, that would end it. They can whine and whimper about, oh, it's too many civilian casualties, or we really want a ceasefire. They can have a ceasefire if they do the one thing that would cause the ceasefire to happen, which is to tell Israel, we're cutting you off. Because Israel is a dependency. Israel has no ability to function independently of U.S. imperialism, and that they won't do. I want to turn, though, to another topic, because you, in your campaign, have been running as a socialist candidate on a pro-working class program. It's also an anti-capitalist program. It's a program for socialist reconstruction of society. You have far-reaching long-term demands and also, sort of short-term demands, immediate demands. I mean, people can go to your website, and by the end of the show, I'll ask you to talk about the website so they can see what a socialist platform actually looks like. But one of the things that you've been addressing very fervently is the needs of working class families and poor families in the United States. Now, the Biden-Harris administration have been in power now for nearly 4 years, have been in an office certainly for 4 years. And as we said, they could have done whatever they wanted to do, and consequently, they did do whatever they wanted to do. Suddenly at the debate, Kamala Harris said, I have a plan to help working class people. I want to play the clip of it. And then I was thinking, when I heard it, and I contrast it with your program, the program you've been calling for to meet the needs of working class families in the United States, it's so empty. But anyway, let's hear what she's saying, and then I want to get your response.
I have a plan to give startup businesses $50,000 tax deduction, to pursue their ambitions, their innovation, their ideas, their hard work. I have a plan, $6,000 for young families for the first year of your child's life, to help you in that most critical stage of your child's development. I have a plan that is about allowing people to be able to pursue what has been fleeting in terms of the American dream by offering a help with down payment of $25,000 down payment assistance for first-time home buyers.
I mean, it sounds ridiculous. I think most people, the pundits all thought Kamala Harris did a good job because expectations were relatively low and she had been well prepped. And so they thought, oh, she really presented fairly well. But most voters, especially working class people, Claudia, they're not thinking, oh, did Kamala make good arguments? They're thinking like, what does she actually stand for? So let's just think about those things. $6,000 per family for a child in the first year of life. Okay, so that's a $6,000 subsidy. A $50,000 tax break for startup businesses. These are meager. This would actually not be life-changing for anyone in crises. And then again, when you compare it to the military-industrial complex in the Pentagon budget of $1 trillion a year, it's so nothing, and yet she's like, I have a plan. And of course, Trump came back to her and said, well, why didn't you do it in the last 4 years? Because you could have. Anyway, it seems so empty. From your point of view, as a socialist, what's your platform addressing the same things that Kamala Harris was trying to address there?
We're trying to address these issues by the root. What is causing these issues that she is trying to resolve in piecemeal solutions, and solutions that aren't enough, that are not going to radically change the conditions of anyone, even those that receive a $6,000 subsidy. I have a kid. I know that $6,000 is not enough, and it's not enough in this economy. And so she talks a lot about an opportunity economy. That's what she calls her plan. What we are calling our plan is economic democracy. People should have guaranteed human rights that are free and accessible. There is no reason why in the wealthiest country in the world, you have over 500,000 people who are homeless. There is no reason why there should be 28 vacant homes for one person who's homeless. There's no reason why price gouging is even a thing. The government could conduct price freezes. They could penalize those corporations that actually are price gouging and literally squeezing the life of out of our people. And so there's so many things that this quote unquote plan that she proposed could have been that are not, precisely because to resolve the problems of working class people would mean going against the system that she represents. It means that rather than signing a bill that finances the genocidal drive against the Palestinian people that cost $26 billion to the American people, you would put 20 billion into resolving the issue of housing in this country. That rather than financing trillions of dollars to the military industrial complex, you'd actually relieve millions of former students from their student debt. And so for us, when we're talking about economic democracy, it's in complete opposition to this question of opportunity economy, knowing that historically it has meant opportunity at the expense, that historically it has meant opportunity for some at the expense of the many. It is never anything that actually solves the root cause of the problems that we face. And so there is much that she could say, $6,000 here, $50 there, $25,000. People should be able to have guaranteed housing. Why should people go into debt with a bank to own a house? Why can't this be something that the state provides a program for, and that people don't have to become indebted because it's a human right for people to have housing? And so, again, I believe strongly that our socialist program is about the reorganization of society in a way that works for working class people and takes out billionaires that are dictating the economy and the politics of this country in favor of their interests at the expense of the majority of people in this country.
I was visiting Portugal recently. It's a capitalist economy. It's a capitalist country. Nobody gets a doctor's bill when they go for basic medical services. Then you go to a country like Cuba, which has a socialist government. Healthcare is a real priority, and nobody gets a doctor's bill. In the United States, 50% of the personal bankruptcies last year were from people who couldn't pay doctor's bills. In a way, you could have a system of Medicare for all, healthcare for all, a national health plan that didn't require a socialist revolution. I mean, if Portugal can have it, and Portugal is a relatively poor, one of the poorer countries in Western Europe, certainly the US could have it. So it's not like it's unachievable. It's not like it requires a full-scale revolution. It's just the vested interests of the pharmaceutical industry, the health insurance companies, the medical equipment manufacturers, mainly the capitalist class. They don't want to change this system because they're making lots of money from healthcare. They treat healthcare as a commodity. When we're sick, we are not patients. We are not human beings who need healthcare. We are consumers. We are customers. In other words, it's the marketplace. So everything is the marketplace. And it seems to me that if the people in the United States start to embrace the socialist program in larger numbers, if they become a formidable force, if they don't accept, like Kamala Harris and the Democrats, or Joe Biden and the Democrats, whoever it is, as the only alternative to right-wing Republicans, if instead they make serious demands and build serious movements, a lot of these things are achievable in the short term. I mean, if the capitalists thought, oh, we're going to give them free health care instead of being overthrown by a socialist revolution, a big part of the capitalist class would say, yeah, let's have free health care. But if they don't feel that fire from below, they're not going to do it because they're making lots of money from it. It's that simple. And I think that's been one of the inspiring parts to me of your campaign, which is it's not just words on a piece of paper. And your socialist platform is a readable platform, but it's the spirit of struggle. The idea that if people band together, unite together, find common roots together and fight together, a lot can be achieved. And a lot of the people right now who are they're voting blue, Democrat, or voting red, Republican, they have a lot more in common with each other than they might imagine. Like all the things I just mentioned are things that actual working class families need, whether you're voting Republican or Democrat. But again, if we're just lined up in society, which of these two capitalist parties are the ones that speak to us, then this other broader, more important unity from below doesn't happen. And I think, to me, that's the other part of your campaign that's been so inspiring to people, is that it's a message that says, look, we can unite from below and we can fight together from below. We might not agree on all things, but there are some things that we agree upon that we all need. And it seems to me that that's kind of the spirit of your campaign. Anyway, that's how I interpret it.
No, that's definitely the spirit. And I think it's important for me to say, we don't think that the real division in this country is between Republicans and Democrats. That is something that is fomented by the ruling class, that there's this divide and this complete opposition from both sides of the aisle. And that is not the truth. The real division in this country is between working class people and the ruling class. And working class people are the majority. And we have the power to demand, to overturn, and to rebuild this society. If we have the will to organize and mobilize our people to take power, economic and political power in this country. And that is what the campaign is about. We've built this Vote Socialist campaign not only for this election cycle, but as part of a larger strategy to build an independent movement of working class people that are conscious, class conscious, and understand that working class people produce everything in this country, produce everything around the world. And we should have enough political and economic power to decide what we do with the collective wealth that we produce. And so when we talk about economic democracy, that's part of it. It's part of having a decision-making power to decide how we are going to redistribute wealth. Where are we going to invest? How are we going to create the society that provides for our families, not only in the immediate, but for generations? And so our platform is not a platform, like you mentioned, that has been written in a piece of paper or on the website and doesn't have life. It comes from struggle. It comes from movement building. It comes from years of experience, not only, experiences that Karina and myself have as organizers, but the experience of a party and the experience of people who have worked alongside the party as well, that may not be party members, but are part of building movement. And so what I say to people all the time when I go across the country is that you don't need to be a socialist to want free access to healthcare. You don't need to be a socialist to want free access to education, free access to, the most basic human things that we need to be able to live and thrive. What we need to be is human. And if we're human and we have human needs, then we need to fight to be able to build a society that reflects that.
Yeah, Claudia, I think those are important words. And one of the reasons I wanted to have this interview, we're a news show, but we have strong feelings and strong beliefs and strong values. We're socialists, and your campaign is a socialist campaign. And personally, I've been supporting your efforts from the beginning. Breakthrough News doesn't support any political candidate. It doesn't involve itself in electoral campaigning or electoral politicking. But I wanted to have you on this show, and I want to have subsequent discussions with the candidates who are being taken out of the electoral process in an unfair way by the two capitalist parties, who are excluded from the debates, who are being targeted by high finance campaigns to evict them from the ballot, even though they've done everything they needed to do to meet the very onerous standards to get ballot access. And I'm talking, again, you're being challenged in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, the Green Party being challenged in many states. I mean, this is an epidemic of sort of targeting progressive third-party candidates, and we have to talk about that. you can't really talk about democracy in general in the abstract. You have to talk about it, the class basis of democracy, what we talked about where Athens had a democracy, but half the people were slaves. Or here in the United States, we have a democracy where you can run, but you can never be in a debate, where you're targeted by political campaigns funded by the ruling class parties to evict you from the ballot. We have to talk about these issues. And then when I look at your website, the program is very welcoming to people. It's like, let's seize the banks and corporations. Let's cut the military budget by 90%. You know, when you think about what it would mean to seize the banks or get rid of capitalist banking, you could go to all the homeowners in America who have 30-year mortgages and tell them, look, a socialist government means your mortgage is gone. You don't have to pay the banks anything. You're done. The house is yours. A lot of people who are not socialists would think, oh, that's a good government because it just got rid of their mortgage, or if you don't have to pay doctor's bills. So I'm agreeing with you, like, you don't actually have to be politically already a socialist to identify with why the socialist program meets the needs of people. Anyway, with that said, how do people find out more about you, given the fact that there's censorship against you, you're excluded from the debates? How do they find you?
We're excluded from the debates. We're shadow banned. You name it. But folks could get in touch with us at votesocialist2024.com, which is a website. You can register to volunteer. We have thousands of volunteers all across the country that are doing outreach. Right now, we have a project that's called Put Socialism on the Map, and folks are out there talking to community members, engaging with them about the socialist program that we are putting forth and the platform and our views to build an independent movement of working class people beyond the elections. There are folks that are out there also in so many ways encouraging others to vote for us in the places where we have ballot access and write in. You could also get information at the website. Folks can follow us at Claudia_Carina in IG, and we also have a Twitter account. So you have every way to connect with us. Please do so. We're interested in building with communities all across the country.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Claudia De La Cruz, she is the presidential candidate for the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Claudia, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.